Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for allowing me to be present today at today's conference. It's a great honor. Thank you again for the invitation. Today, I would like to share with you some thoughts about Asia in general, about rising xenophobia in specific, and basically what I think are the tools that we can use today around the globe, and specifically in Asia, to combat it, so to speak. So I promise I won't take too long. I just want to go really over the very basics of what I think the situation is today. So first of all, when we think about Asia, we have to remember we're talking about a huge continent. We're talking about 4.7 billion people, which is about 60% of the world's population today. We have to actually comprehend that what we do in Europe or in North America or in South America basically pales in comparison to the quantity of people for the size of the economy that we're talking about. And not only that, but also the diversity of such an enormous continent. When we say diversity, we mean a lot of different things. We mean religions, we mean languages, we mean politics. Of course, we mean very, very different things, but let's go over them, well, not, if not one by one, but in some generalities, if I may. First of all, about the multi-ethnicity of Asia, which is incredibly diverse. Even from an ethnic perspective, the continent is huge and very, very diverse. Naturally, we're talking about East Asians, about South Asians, about Middle Eastern people, about Central Asian people who, not even us as Europeans who, pardon my supposition, don't know much generally about Asia. Even we would not consider it as one homogeneous place, so to speak. We're talking about over 2,000 languages. We're talking about very different cultures. We're talking about a multitude of very, very, very different religions. And as I said, political systems as well that we can see around the continent. Now, very simply, I would like to go over them from a regional perspective, not from a geographical perspective. It's very important to add these regions are more important from the perspective of the issues that we're trying to tackle today, which is xenophobia and racism in general. And what I believe is that these situations or that these appearances of xenophobia are very, very different from region to region in Asia. So very quickly, allow me to just go over a few of them. First of all, we're talking about East Asia, where these countries generally, where we see societies that are mostly homogeneous. What I mean by that is that over 90% of the population, specifically in these four countries, is basically the same. They belong to the same group of people, the same ethnicity of people, specifically in Japan, in Korea, and in Mongolia. In China, we're talking about slightly less, only 90% of the population belongs to the same ethnicity. We're talking about the Han in general here. And then we have 10% who are minorities, if you will. Don't forget that when we're speaking about minorities in China, we're talking about tens of millions of people. So when we encounter xenophobia and racism here, it's a mainly, how should I put it, theoretical thing. When a Japanese person is xenophobic, it is most likely that he has never seen a foreigner in their lives, except via the media. When a Chinese person or when a Korean person thinks about other races, it is more often than not a theoretical comprehension of only things they know by stories via the media, which can obviously be influenced depending on the freedom of the media at the country at present that we're talking about. So it's not ever based, or mostly never based, on personal experiences or actual experiences from their everyday lives. It is more often than not influenced by the politics, by the current global status of the country, by generally foreign relations, and what by the state wants to let them know, or what the state is trying, what information the state is trying to get across. Now, if we move on to Southeast Asia, for example, the situation is again very, 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 very different, because in Southeast Asia, we're not talking about homogeneous societies at all. Now, with these countries, we are talking about a very, very big mixture of populations. We're talking about countries where we can't even speak about really a plurality of the population, of multi-ethnic societies with several religions, with several languages, with varying differences between themselves. If you think about Malaysia and Indonesia, where we have hundreds of languages, we have a very, very big variety of different religions. We have Muslims, we have Buddhists, we have Hindus in very, very large quantities. But I will go into specific examples later on, where we cannot really speak again of homogeneous societies. We're talking about a mixture. And in this case, when we see xenophobia, when we see racism, it is actually something that you encounter in your everyday lives. When you're talking about the political system or the education system, giving priorities to certain ethnic groups within the populace, on who can get into universities or who gets to be represented in the government. Here, racism, xenophobia, or ethnic conflicts are an actual daily subject, are a daily discussion, with laws against discrimination in many places in place, with more or less success. And obviously these are the countries which we see on the news on a daily basis, in Myanmar and Cambodia, where we do actually see very bloody ethnic conflicts occurring even today on a very regular basis. Now, if we move onwards to Central Asia, what we refer to as the stands, if you will, again, the situation is very different. Obviously, these are all formerly part of the Soviet Union, which were grouped together from a decision of a colonizer, for need of a better word. Here we're already talking about both religious and ethnic or even tribal conflicts in many, many, many occasions. And naturally, we're talking about, on one side, the Russian population, which is Russian Orthodox in many cases, and the local population, which is mostly Muslim, not Arab Muslim, it is important to add, but more Turkish tribal societies that we see here. And here, we're not really talking about cultural differences, we are talking mostly about tribal or society differences, where the language is fairly similar, the religion is basically the same, but to highly oversimplify the matter, we're talking about what color the tent is into various cities. So obviously an exaggeration. So we're talking about minor cultural differences that create very, very severe conflicts between different groups within these countries, which were once again divided, as we know very well from the Middle East, by colonizers when the borders were drawn up by foreign powers in many occasions. And this, of course, creates a lot of conflicts. Now, probably the best example of foreign powers dividing up territories is South Asia. The situation of India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, where it was basically the British who decided where the new borders will be after the area left the British Empire. And here, of course, we're talking about a very similar culture, but a vast religious difference between Hindus and Muslims. Naturally, I'm not claiming that India is a country with a single culture. That's very far from the truth. We're talking about, again, a multitude of languages and a multitude of different cultures. But we can say that both India and Pakistan share very, very deep cultural roots, and the division between them is mostly affected or mostly created even by foreign influence, which creates a lot of tension today. Displacement of populations for decades is still causing a lot of tensions today. Now, another region within Asia, because don't forget, this is in a huge area, is the Caucasus, which we again see in the news on a daily basis. These xenophobia and racism here are again a very, very different issue. Again, we're speaking about historical tensions. We're talking about territorial disputes, about foreign influence in many cases. If you excuse me, I will not go into the Middle East because I think we hear enough about that as it is, especially amongst ourselves. Let me give you just two specific examples from Asia, two very different ones. One is China. Now, in China, the Constitution actually prohibits any sort of discrimination. However, foreigners are foreigners. Foreigners are called laowai, basically in modern Chinese vernacular, and that does create a lot of tensions. Basically, 90% of the population belongs to the Han ethnicity, and we have 56 minorities. That's the following 10%. Now, the minorities themselves are not obviously considered foreign. They are Chinese in every sense of the word, but within Chinese culture, they represent different smaller ethnicities. Now, the fact that we do have a 90% homogeneous society does create tension for the small minority, and again, the small minority being 140 million people, for them in their everyday lives. And just to get into a little bit of detail with that, when we're talking about within these 56 minorities, we have the phenomenon of what many foreigners and the Chinese would disagree, would call cultural genocide. When we talk about this, we mainly refer to Tibet and to Inner Mongolia, to autonomous territories within the People's Republic of China, where the schooling system is slowly shifting towards a system where bilingualism is not that supported. Everything has to be mainly in Chinese, and local languages, Mongolian and Tibetan in this specific cases, is very much put into the background, or even disencouraged. Anti-Muslim sentiments in China are fairly high most of the time. There is a very large percentage of the population which is Muslim. Different minorities in China are Muslim in their religion, be that the Hui minority, who are ethnically Chinese but Muslim, all the way to the Uyghur or Xinjiang minority, which we hear quite a lot about, which are a Turkish or Turkic ethnic group who are also Muslim. There are very large variations between group and group, but there are very high anti-Muslim sentiments within the country. Then we have the foreigners. We have people of African descent, quite a few of them in China, as China supports very, very large and wide-ranging cooperation with various African countries. There are a lot of students and a lot of business people and a lot of diplomats in China. We can, I think, justifiably say that Chinese society is very unwelcoming towards people of African descent in general. They don't have to be specifically from African descent, but they can even be European or American, but with a darker skin color. Of course, they are distrustworthy of them in general, to the extent that the cab driver might not actually stop for a person with an African descent. That is more and more common in China today. And of course, there is generally a very antagonistic relationship with Japan due to historical reasons, for ongoing conflicts, for different perceptions of history, and etc. So in China, even though the population is pretty homogeneous, 90% come from the same ethnic background, there are a lot of tensions. Even though discrimination is forbidden by law, and there is very specific legislation against it, we do see it on a daily basis. Now, if we switch to another example, Malaysia, there we see multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society where we have Malays and Chinese and Indians, and all these have very different religions, but even Malays can be Buddhists or Hindus or Muslims, the Chinese, of course, and the Indians as well. So ethnicity doesn't go with religion specifically. There are various variations. We're talking about hundreds of different languages within the country, of course. And here the Constitution does try to give priorities to certain ethnic groups that may have been neglected in the past. This obviously creates a vicious cycle when you take one minority and put them above the rest, or give them priorities in education, in culture, in loans, in marital status, in everything. That does create a situation where another minority is going to get neglected. In Malaysia, conflicts are less, I would say. However, it is present in everyday life, specifically because of the multicultural nature of the country itself. Now, all of these conflicts are being continuously addressed, of course, by various means. And what I would like to mainly focus on today is the utilization of soft power. How we can use culture and education as our two primary tools to combat this phenomena, or what is actually done today. Now, when we speak about education from a very simplistic perspective, I would like to divide between primary and secondary education and tertiary education. Because when we're teaching children about foreign cultures, about foreign countries, I think the first thing we have to do is give them access to this information, and access to foreign information is usually primarily done by language education, because our goal today in most education systems is not teach them something specific, but to teach them how to access information in the future. And obviously, without speaking at least English, surfing online is very, very difficult. So for children in primary and secondary education, most governments in Asia, of course, put a very large emphasis on language education. We do see a very high decrease in foreign language education, which goes hand in hand with political aspirations of countries. In China, there are new laws deregulating, or basically regulating, the reduction of foreign language education, because the Chinese government claims that there is less need for Chinese children to speak a foreign language. They should focus on local culture and local education, and there is no need for the average Chinese person to be able to access either foreign media or foreign people in general. So that is a very specific tool, not only to raise awareness, but from the other side to block out information, block out a globalization, if you will, depending, of course, on the political agenda at hand. Now, when we move on to tertiary education, we move on from language education to philological studies. We teach culture, we teach history, we teach literature, we teach art, etc. Because when we're talking about tertiary education, we're already assuming that they know how to access information. At this point, we give them guidelines, what kind of information is available out there, and we can direct people. When we work with tertiary institutions, we give them directions or sources or resources on how to gain information, depending on the type of information they're looking for, be that art, be that sciences, etc. Now, this is the educational part. When we're discussing culture, the situation is, of course, a little different. Of course, I mentioned culture in tertiary education, but here the task or the responsibility moves away from the common state-funded education system, and now we're broadening up a bit. We're talking about cultural centers, we're talking about museums, we're talking about galleries, concert halls, theaters, with whom we have to work with. When I say us or we, it is the people who want to combat xenophobia in general, be that an NGO, a government, a religious group, an association, etc. It's the cultural centers, the institutions that diffuse various art forms that we have to work together with. Because one of the easiest ways to turn to a populace, and I will give you examples today, is to give them cultural products. With a cultural product, think about, from a very simplistic perspective, the reason why everyone knows the United States of America is because of modern pop music, is because of Hollywood, because of these cultural products that were diffused around the world, and everyone basically, more or less, has some or access to them to some extent. So when we're trying to diffuse cultural tensions, when we're trying to reduce xenophobia, culture is one of the main tools that is at our disposal. Now, who are the people who diffuse culture in a way? What are those, so to speak, cultural embassies around the globe that we can work with or we can try to associate ourselves with? Very surprisingly, the continent with the most awful colonial history in the world, specifically Europe, is the continent that does its best, or in my opinion, the best work in diffusing culture through cultural institutions or cultural institutes around the world. These are the l'Institut Français, the Goethe Institute, the Instituto Cervantes, the Italian Dante Alighieri Institute, the Hungarian Cultural Center, of which we have 26 around the globe today. And of course, a different example from an Asian perspective is the Confucius Institute, with hundreds of centers around the globe, where their specific goal is using the tools of soft power to address a population directly without going through government. So we're talking about language education and cultural events. And at the Confucius Institute, you can study calligraphy and martial arts. At the Hungarian Cultural Centers, you can study music via the Kodai method. At the French Institute, you can learn French cooking. At the Goethe Institute, you can read German literature. The Cervantes Institute represents all Spanish-speaking countries while diffusing their cultures, their customs, their traditions, etc., etc. So all these various institutions' work is basically combating xenophobia, combating racism, while trying to disseminate their own cultural products to as many people as they can. Because very logically, from a government perspective, when you support the dissemination of culture, you bring people closer to you. You make other countries, or better yet, the people of other countries understand you more. They will be more willing to buy your products. They will be more willing to do business with you. And at the end of the day, that is the priority of most governmental organizations today. Let us be honest. So while the Kodai music teaching method is a treasure of humanity, the point of having children learn music via the Kodai method is, when they grow up, they'll be willing to do business with Hungary. That is, of course, the point here. Now, after culture, go back to public education, or to education in general. This is a very different thing, because who is to educate people? And I'm not talking about children, and this is a fairly controversial idea, or a very controversial message in a way, because when you're trying to educate someone, you are assuming that they are uneducated. And this is a problem. What gives us or anyone else the right to try and educate someone else? Nonetheless, these various institutions or NGOs are doing their best to teach people about different cultures. And I'm giving you a few examples here from things that I perceive as institutions or organizations that deal with this sort of thing. We can think of communication channels and TV channels like Heti TV in Hungary, which very specifically deals with disseminating Jewish culture in a country in Europe which desperately needs to know more about Jewish culture, not because the lack of Jewish culture in the country, but because people's understanding of Jewish culture is many times diametrically opposed to reality. Or the Sukhnut, the Jewish Agency for Israel, which deals specifically with teaching Jewish people about Israel. Or if we think about Balintaz, which again caters to a larger Jewish community in Hungary, or Bnei Brit, which on a global scale is trying to both teach Jews on one hand and to teach other organizations, other countries, other schools about what being Jewish actually means. And it is the responsibility or the task of these organizations around the globe to try to combat cultural misunderstandings, trying to combat xenophobia, racism in general, with various educational means. They either cater directly towards children, directly towards youth, or larger populations in general, using various tools that are at their disposal. Now, my point today is, of course, is that we don't have a solution. Combating xenophobia, be it in Asia or anywhere else, I think is a lifelong task, and we have to try and use all the tools at our disposal. And culture and education, though I think two of the most important tools, are definitely not the only ones. The publication of books, of teaching materials, the education of teachers and educators in general is a very, very important part, which personally I think that not only private organizations or NGOs, but governments should and do, admittedly, must take part in as well. Now, the situation in Asia is, of course, not similar in many ways to the situation in Europe, because in Europe, in comparison to Asia, of course, we are talking about a much more homogeneous, just use that word again, society. We have much more similar cultural backgrounds, even linguistically, not including Hungarian, of course, but we're talking about an Indo-European language family, first and foremost, a Sprachbund, if you will, where we have a lot of commonalities. These things don't exist in Asia because of the sheer size, because of the sheer vastness, and as such, taking Asia as one single topic, as one single theme, is generally more difficult due to the reasons I explained. However, we do have the option to use the various tools at our disposal in each of these countries. That's all I wanted to say for today. Thank you so much for listening to me, and have a lovely conference. Thank you.